Welcome. This is the panel discussion being hosted by the Farmers Markets of Nova Scotia. And we're here to have a conversation about the rising cost of food and how a local food system fits into all that. Let me give you a bit of introduction about where the conversation is going to go. And then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in. Maybe you've seen it in the news lately, or maybe you're looking at your latest grocery bill and wondering how it is that your food costs are so high. You know, the cauliflower that costs $7 that we keep hearing about. Well, it's no secret, food costs are rising in Canada and in Nova Scotia as well. The weak dollar, as well as environmental changes, are affecting crops in countries where we import food. Climate and environmental changes are contributing to unpredictable shortages. The rising cost of cauliflower, the sharp recent cost, was a combination of the lowering of the Canadian dollar and a supply shortage as California experienced a severe drought. According to the Food Institute at Guelph University, 81% of all fruits and vegetables in Canada are imported, and the numbers in Nova Scotia are much the same. In Nova Scotia, it was found that 13% of the food consumed in Nova Scotia is produced locally. And our reliance on imported food leaves us highly vulnerable to currency fluctuations, and that's what we're experiencing now. The rising cost of food is affecting all Canadians, particularly those living on low incomes. Certainly, the lower household income, the higher their risk of food insecurity. So where do we go from here? Over the next hour, we'll look at the current situation, its causes and impacts, as well as what we can expect in the coming months. We'll also look at the role of local food and the impact of localizing our food system here in Nova Scotia. There are three terms that you'll likely hear throughout the evening for the purposes of this panel, and I thought they might be worth just spelling out quickly. So again, for the purposes of this panel, when we use the term local food, we're generally speaking about food that is grown, caught, raised, or produced in Nova Scotia. And when we're talking about a food system, we're talking simply about the path that food takes from field to fork. So growing, harvesting, processing, packaging, marketing, transporting, consuming, and even the disposal of food. The dominant food system is often called the industrial food system, and it's a global system in which Canada and Nova Scotia import and export food. A more localized food system, in contrast, is more rooted in a place and serving of that place. And lastly, the term food security will certainly come up throughout our conversation this evening, and we'll dive in much deeper. But as a starting point, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs, their food preferences, and are able to live in that way, able to live an active and healthy life. So let me give you a quick introduction to our panelists. First, we have Anne Huntley. Anne and her husband Joel operate Moontide Farm, a small-scale, family-run mixed farming enterprise in the beautiful Scots Bay, Nova Scotia. Moontide Farm sells at the Wolfville Farmers Market. They operate a community-supported agriculture program, and they maintain an on-farm produce stand. Their farm is built on principles of healthy and sustainable rural landscape and economy. Andrew Bergel is an instructor at the College of Sustainability at Dalhousie. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science, a Killiam Scholar, and a Doctoral Fellow at the European Union Center of Excellence. Prior to moving to Nova Scotia, Andrew worked in banking and finance in New York City. And he's our resident economist on this panel tonight. Welcome, Andrew. And then we have Amy Carson. Amy is a community food coordinator with the Ecology Action Center and co-chair of the Halifax Food Policy Alliance. She works with individuals and communities to build and expand local food infrastructure and on other initiatives that aim to strengthen the local food system here in Nova Scotia. Amy is also the owner of Beanstalk Baby Food, a local company that makes frozen, handcrafted baby food using locally sourced ingredients. And lastly, I'm Kelty Butler, the Executive Director of the Farmers Markets of Nova Scotia Cooperative, and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight. So from there, I think we'll actually jump right in and ask Andrew if he can give us a bit of context to the conversation, maybe adding to why food costs are rising, what we can expect to see in the coming months, and are food trends like this commonplace in our economic system?
Hello and good evening, everyone. I think that you were really right to point out that it's really a global system. And I think in that regard, Canada sort of finds itself in a particularly difficult spot within that system, and that is that Canada is very heavily dependent upon a single trading partner, and that tends to be the United States. In the recent year or two, we've seen the US dollar rise pretty dramatically across the board, but especially strongly against the Canadian dollar. And one of the reasons for that really is that the Canadian dollar was more or less pinned to the price of oil, unfortunately. And as oil collapsed, so did the Canadian dollar. This sort of left a problem for Canada long term, and one of that is, of course, inflation. Is as your dollar grows weaker, then anything you import costs more, and when you import something that costs more, you have to pass that on to your consumer, which is one of the main reasons why food has become so much more expensive. And one of the problems with food especially is that it's a perishable good, so you tend to see the inflation come a little bit faster than you do in durable goods, where you can fill your inventory for 6 months, maybe even a year in some cases, at prices a year ago, whereas now you have to replenish food relatively quickly, so you're constantly at the mercy of that lowering currency. That said, there are some things that are good for the food industry overall, with the lowering prices of commodities and oil, and so because oil is one of the main components for things like fertilizer, and so it's kind of Canada is being particularly badly hit because of its currency pinned to oil. But for other countries, it hasn't been quite as dramatic because they've been able to reap the benefits of lower inputs. So this puts Canada in a sort of a particularly difficult situation, and perhaps one where looking to more local industries would be advantageous. Often countries in the past have looked at sort of the damage that a lower currency has done to their economy as a way of using that to springboard into relying more on local industry, and also for exports, because now products made in Canada are cheaper to sell abroad, which is another option if local markets get even stronger, if local food sort of industries here get even stronger. So it's kind of difficult to say exactly what will happen in the coming months. It's always dangerous to try to predict these things. But I would say that we are not going to be seeing oil coming back anytime very soon. It looks like we have a lot of slowdown in the global economy, which will, pretty much lower demand and continue to keep that demand low. We also have a lot of technology increases in the oil extraction, which makes it cheaper to pull out and more types of oil accessible. So all that being said, I think what you're looking at in the coming months is probably a bit more of the same. One of the only possible silver linings for food prices coming from abroad would be if El Nino does cause a lot more rain in California and the American Southwest, where a lot of these products come from. But I don't think in the case of Canada that it's going to help nearly as much as it might elsewhere. Perhaps they say for the domestic U.S. economy, it'll be more of a help than it will here because of that currency conversion. So this does provide an interesting opportunity to look to create a local food industry that could be more resilient and could also be there in the future regardless of market fluctuations. Because I think that that's really the key, is that you don't want to build an industry around a market fluctuation, because they are fleeting and eventually that industry will then get exposed. So I think the key is to use this opportunity to figure out the best way to implement a local food industry here, and one in which is efficient and effective long term.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So then that sort of leads me to wonder what the impacts of local food are here on the ground. And we've certainly been seeing some of this in media coverage. Food Secure Canada has been quite active on it. But Amy or Anne, could you add to that conversation in terms of what does it look like on the ground for Nova Scotians? What does it look like for you as a farmer and a business owner? And Andrew, feel free to jump in on that as well.
Sure, I can go ahead if you like, Anne.
Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the effects of the rising food costs are quite varied, and one of the stats that Diana from Food Secure Canada often quotes is that 1 in 8 households in Canada are still having trouble feeding their families, and that's roughly 4 million Canadians. And so I think for these people who are already struggling to sort of afford food and be able to feed their families, rising food costs impacts them a lot more. And so, you know, when we think about the effects on the ground, those who are particularly vulnerable are those who are already affected by issues of food security. So these are people living on low or fixed incomes and social assistance, people who live in rural and remote communities who already have difficulties accessing food. So I just want to state that although the rising food costs do affect everyone, they definitely affect a certain sector of the population more. And right now in Canada and in Nova Scotia, that is a very big portion of our population. So I think that's really important. And then the other thing I would add, we're also going to be seeing other trends. So I was recently in conversation with a restaurant owner, and he said, well, you know, I'm changing the things that I'm serving because I just can't afford to buy certain kinds of vegetables anymore, and so I'm actually shifting what I'm serving my customers. So there's repercussions like that, and for me as a local business owner, I'm looking at, wow, you know, I mean, I never did buy imported vegetables, but now it actually reiterates the fact that purchasing from local farmers makes a whole lot of sense.
Great. And just before you jump in, I'll just add to what Amy was saying. Amy, you mentioned that the stats are that 1 in 8 households in Canada, and stats that were released by the Canadian Journal of Public Health describe Nova Scotia as having the highest level of food insecurity in the country, with about 17% food insecurity in Nova Scotia and 20% almost in Halifax in particular. So that, you know, would be 1 in 5 people facing food insecurity in Halifax. So certainly it's a very important piece of this you know, multifaceted conversation and situation. Mm-hmm. Anne, did you want to think in there?
I'm not sure that this is the appropriate time to mention it, but I also feel that as a local farmer, sometimes we have unrealistic seasonal expectations, and so people adjusting their diet, or maybe perhaps not quote-unquote needing strawberries in January or cauliflower in February, maybe a more realistic approach as well. We do have frozen foods that are flash frozen when they're fresh, and that is a good alternative for a lot of people. So I think sometimes our expectations are not matching reality for folks as well.
And for me, and that really speaks to the idea of, you know, what is the real cost of food and what are those externalities? Andrew, would you mind sort of giving us a bit of an understanding of externalities in our economic system?
Sure. I mean, unfortunately, they're actually looked at that way because we tend to pretend that we can just externalize them and not have them affect the system. But the true fact is that the externalities affect a lot of things, and a lot of it could be even a lot of the carbon footprint when it comes to food. And this can cause, obviously, things like climate change and accelerate that, as well as cause damage to the economy in general. Unfortunately, the way that economists have generally looked at externalities is that they are something that shouldn't really be accounted for in that particular system. In some cases, externalities are even kind of looked upon sort of favorably because, well, they create other cottage industries around them to help clean them up, and therefore it creates more growth. So when we count everything in terms of absolute growth, sometimes externalities, you know, can seem, oh, not the worst thing in the world, but the truth is that we live in some something that we live in a closed system. We live on one planet. We can't just get rid of stuff. So now they're coming back to really haunt us. A lot of the externalities we never counted throughout the 20th century, a lot of the using coal-fired power plants, using various chemicals and things like paper mills, the destruction of the overuse of water in industrial agriculture. All of these things are now coming back, and they're part of the reasons why we have things like droughts or why we have issues like that. I mean, California itself is almost kind of like a constructed state, given how all the water was moved down into a desert to basically grow a lot of things. So this now is coming back to haunt us a little bit. And I think that the point that was made that we don't just need to look at using local food and eating local food, we also need to look at the idea of eating seasonally, because that would also, I think, perhaps enhance the local food market and make it more competitive than if it has to compete against strawberries coming from California, which have to be transported all the way over here. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of having cheap oil is that transportation is also cheaper. So that's one of the things that I think that the local food industry will have to gauge when it decides to compete against a lot of these imports coming in, especially if the Canadian dollar begins to strengthen again.
Kelty, I would just add, that was a list of a whole bunch of externalities that sometimes are quite easy to think about. And one thing that's coming up more and more is like now we're even seeing social externalities, like in the form of the obesity epidemic, healthcare costs, things like that, that are actually, furthering this issue around embedded costs in the food system that are not showing up. And so I just wanted to add, like, those are also some of these externalities that are actually showing up in the human population, which, are sort of feeding into this issue.
And so, this for me sort of brings up a bit of the conversation that happens around the idea of should food be cheap? We often, currently, it's very popular to use the language of rights. So a right to clean water, a right to clean air, and things like that. And sometimes food gets brought into that as well. And in some ways, I think it sort of paints the picture as, yes, there's one thing to say good food, affordable food, or healthy food should be a right. But what does that mean in terms of affordability? Is there a difference between affordable food and being able to afford food, given our current socioeconomic situation? How do we sort of bring those two into play? Because there are people like Anne who are growing our food. And so cheap food is certainly not a way to sustain our agriculture industry or our farmers in our rural communities. Anne, would you have anything to say about that?
I guess from the farm perspective, or as a farmer, the one thing that we encounter a lot with our customers is that we would like to make a living doing the profession that we have chosen to do and have spent time educating ourselves and working at, and getting better and better with each growing season. So generally, I would say with small-scale farmers, all of us work for less than minimum wage, and we're talking about food insecurity, but I think even sometimes among farmers we're food insecure because we're competing against grocery stores, which are working on such large volumes with such large companies with such cheap transportation. Our seed costs are going up also with the dollars. Our input costs also go up. We don't use fertilizer, so we don't reap that benefit. But yeah, so we are also trying to make a living, and so for us the cost of food is based on our cost of production. What does it actually cost us to produce this food, making a wage of not anything exorbitant, but a family, $12 an hour would be nice to make, as a wage. I don't think we're asking for anything exorbitant here. So some of that is, efficiencies within your own business. You get better at things, or more expedient or leaner on your own farms. But yeah, I guess, should food be cheap? I don't think it should be a whole lot cheaper than it is right now, because I think many local farmers struggle to make ends meet as it is.
And in sort of putting a few background thoughts together for tonight, I did come across a couple of stats around, how much Canadians are spending on food. I have heard it a few times in terms of while food costs are rising, the percentage of our we spend on food is not rising, or it hasn't risen. So a find was one from media coverage from back in 2011, where it was said that food prices have consistently trended higher over the years, but the percentage of household spending devoted to food has fallen significantly. And another piece, which was from Oxfam Canada, which said that Canadians spend less than 10% of their income on food. So to me, that's sort of an interesting piece to bring in as well. Andrew, do you have any sort of thoughts around that? And I'm sure some of that relates to as we move away from spending the majority of our income on our basic needs, but maybe you can add a bit more to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this is the constant battle between sort of the consumer and the idea of local production. So it may be initially a little bit more expensive to buy locally, but I think that over time you reap the benefits of that because you keep the money also locally, and so it begins to circulate that way. And you, your neighbors, people down the street, your community, your city, and even your province can reap the benefits of that. But there is sort of this idea, it's kind of like the first law of microeconomics is that consumers are self-interested. And so they're going to always want to pay the cheapest price. And so if the supermarket can import things from abroad, industrial scale, that are highly commoditized, and that supply chain is very cheap and can bring it to that supermarket, they may very well go and buy that instead because it's in their self-interest to pay less. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is when we were discussing a moment ago externalities and things like obesity, a lot of that is because of buying cheaper, sort of less nutritious food because we think, well, as long as we have the calories we need to get through the day, well, then that's fine, and I spend less money. So, but that has an externality later on, and one that impacts the local economy quite dramatically because the healthcare expenditures are huge. So the trick is to figure out something that's far more holistic of an approach and to try to convince not just the local government to come on board, the local industry to come on board, but also it's really about educating the consumer and getting the local consumer to come on board with this idea that yes, maybe you will pay a little bit more at times for something locally, but that money will stay within the system locally, and therefore will benefit you and offer more economic opportunity within that system, as well as probably be a lot more nutritious in a lot of ways.
And so, Anne, from a farming perspective, are you seeing some rising costs for you as a farmer? Are there certain inputs that you are bringing in your way of farming that you can expect to have increase in price, or what can we sort of expect to see in the local food system compared to in our grocery stores and in more of the industrial food system?
So we've just done our crop planning for the year, and ordered seeds and that sort of thing. And we do use a lot of, we use non-GMO seeds, and we use small seed houses and then some larger ones. But we do have our specific favorites, and we do use one seed house that's local in Maine, Johnny's Selected Seed, and they're in the U.S. And so our seed prices are significantly more this year. For those things, and then we will have to sort of distribute that out. In addition, we're also seeing our growing mixes are more expensive this year, and I don't know exactly why that is, but the companies are owned by multinationals in many cases, and the Canadian dollar isn't strong, and so even though we get growing mix from Halifax Seed or New Brunswick, Cardwell Farms in New Brunswick, it's still impacting that. So how much will we see things go up? Not terribly. We don't like to shock our customers any more than we like to be shocked when we shop for things. We'll try to keep things within reason, certainly, but I would say maybe 5 or 10%, just because we're experiencing those costs, and the farmer can only we can only eat so much loss. So.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so I think we're headed more and more into that conversation of how a localized or a more localized food system can help us out in our current situation and sort of paint a different picture and a more resilient picture for Nova Scotia. So I've got a bit of a question. I think I'll start with Amy on it. And that's sort of what strategies or approaches can we look at to enhance our individual and our collective resilience in the face of this complex situation of rising costs of food, import reliance, food insecurity? Does this situation make the case for more investment in a local food system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it builds the case for a lot of things, and the shift away from imports is a really big one. But first of all, I will mention something that often gets missed in this conversation, and that is the notion of conservation. So food waste is a massive issue in the food system, and I think the amount of food waste that happens at a household, at a retail, and at an institutional level is insane. I mean, I think I read a stat that was around like $31 billion a year, and that was from 2014. So the issue of food waste has to come up in this conversation somewhere, as it is a really important consideration when we look at how to sort of rebuild a more sustainable food system. Secondly, I would say it really comes with a shift or a switch to diets and local food infrastructure that is more regional. So as Anne was mentioning earlier, I think generally consumer sort of awareness and understanding about what it means to shift our diets to a more regional, to a more regional diet, basically, and understanding what foods are produced locally, what we can expect to find from local farmers and things like that, showing up at the farmers market and actually validating that assumption that the farmers markets are more expensive, which, as we know, in many cases they are not. And so I think we make a lot of assumptions about local food which actually aren't tested in our day-to-day lives. The other area, I think, sits a little bit more within government, whether that be municipalities or provincial governments, and that really is investing in local food infrastructure. And when I say that, I mean everything from protecting agricultural lands, preserving our watersheds, things like that, to building that sort of local food infrastructure that we absolutely have lost over time, both in Nova Scotia and in Canada. So we've seen both distribution and retail being consolidated. I mean, there are certain situations where in Nova Scotia we've maintained some diversification of crops and things like that, but fundamentally distribution and retail are becoming more and more consolidated, and so I think efforts need to be focused there. We've lost a lot of processing facilities. The ability to process and manufacture goods here in Nova Scotia is slowly dwindling, and there are other issues like farmers are getting older and not being replaced. So I think investments in all of those kinds of things are absolutely critical. And I would say finally, the third strategy is around public policy. So we talked earlier about the tension between affordable food and people being able to afford food. The root cause of food insecurity is poverty. So in order to address people being able to afford food, we need to critically examine the social policies that support people in having enough income and being able to afford food. There are also policies related to food and agriculture, local procurement policies, healthy eating guidelines, all of these things that can be applied to institutions and things like that. So I would say within those three buckets, there are a lot of ways that we can address this.
Anne or Andrew, I just want to welcome you guys to jump in if that spurred any thoughts forward for you, and if not, I'm happy to put out another question. But I think I saw Anne noting a few things down.
Well, I think that they're all really. I guess I'm thankful for the opportunity to have even an hour-long panel to discuss some of these things because it's such a complex issue, and those buckets are overflowing. There are so many ways, really, that we can get more local food to support and sustain and build a local food system. There's so many ways to sort of address these issues. From a farming perspective, as a small farmer, I absolutely see the need for infrastructure development, even to comply with health codes and traceability things that the government wants folks to do, but for small farmers it's really, really difficult to comply with. To have help from the government, either navigating those systems or also financial help to just reset up the processing plants or the lines to freeze food. Or we don't have that sort of infrastructure in Canada or in Nova Scotia at this point anymore. And so I think that those are, if we want to talk about a real viable local food system that helps, I would love to see 30 small farms rather than one big industrial farm growing lots of food for folks. And if the infrastructure were there to help us do that, that would be great. Currently, the public policy, at least coming from the Department of Agriculture, doesn't seem to be geared towards that. However, their ears are somewhat open and they're listening at this point to small farmers. I've seen steps going towards that direction, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that 100%. I think that you need to look at the downstream activities, even beyond the farms, to make sure that this can be in a holistic approach. Because I think, okay, as an American, I'm going to say something now that might kind of get everyone a little bit upset, but I think that one of the biggest problems that I've really encountered getting to know the Canadian market a lot better since I've been here is that Canada seems to be a place where everyone is very happy to just sort of give all of their resources away and not get anything value added out of it. Things even like the obsession over the Keystone Pipeline to get all the oil down, that was all to get all the oil down to the States to refine it there and give all of those good cushy refining jobs to Americans, and the Canadians didn't want to do it here. And so it's very happy to give away the resource, but not happy to actually make the money on the value-added industry. And so that also needs to be approached within the system, because if you just have the farmers, you don't have all of the industry and the smaller industries around it and the larger industries around it that create tons of jobs and can actually create the economic engine that you're looking for and can make that a really powerful component of your economy. And that can be such a powerful aspect of it that at that point, farmers here in Nova Scotia may not even have to just depend on Nova Scotians for their only market. They can even begin to export out. And that would be quite wonderful, especially given that we have all these free trade agreements coming up, whether it's with Europe or Asia Pacific. And if Nova Scotia isn't ready for those, they could be overwhelmed by products coming from externally imported in. However, if the industries here can be made more resilient and more integrated, then you could have a very powerful economic engine within the province. And so this is really, I think, a problem that's a bit Canada-wide, but is especially acute here in the Maritimes and Nova Scotia.
And maybe on that note, does anyone on the panel have a perspective on Nova Scotia in terms of sort of how we have some, I guess, strong points, or where we do have good footing to build our local food system from? I mean, I can certainly think in terms of the farmers market sector, as I love to sort of proudly share. We have the highest number of farmers markets per capita in Canada. And in our farmers markets across the province, there are over 1,500 individual businesses operating. And some of those are certainly on a very small scale, and some of them are on a much larger scale. I mean, we have businesses selling out of the farmers market that are making a living, that are making their living, and are also employing other people. And whether that's in primary production or, as Andrew was mentioning, this value-added aspect. And that is certainly a piece that we are hearing from the provincial government, from the Department of Agriculture, is wanting to do more value-adding. But value-adding requires infrastructure, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think the only thought that's coming to me is that, and I can't speak to this definitively, but I have no doubt that our agricultural capacity is entirely underutilized. So, you know, yes, we have a short growing season, but, you know, there are a lot of season extension techniques that farmers are using, and also there is a lot of land that is currently untapped that could be used for agricultural production. And so when we look at, I think we are producing a good diversity of crops here in Nova Scotia, you know, given the weather that we have here and the shorter season. However, I don't believe, from what I've read, that we are tapped out in terms of the amount of food that we could be producing and setting up, as Andrew says, for potential trade and things like that. I mean, I know that we are seeing redundancies in trade in Nova Scotia. You know, we're bringing in apples while we export some of, you know, these world-renowned varieties, and I think that is a major, major issue. Like, let's feed local populations before we start exporting, you know, massive amounts of things. However, I still think something comes back to the amount of land that we actually have under production, and how we can start to increase that and build the infrastructure to be able to support that value add stuff.
And Anne,
I mean,
as a farmer, oh, sorry, Andrew, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I think you're always going to need to import some things, but I think
Absolutely.
that, you know, what Amy's getting at is totally true, and that it doesn't need to be at the level that it is right now, and it can also be a much more of a give and take instead of pretty much just a take overall, which is what it seems to be in a lot of categories.
Mm-hmm.
And Anne, what I was going to say was just as a farmer on the ground, yeah, do you have a sense of, I guess, both resiliency from our farming community? I know you're certainly very passionate about it. And also, you know, do you have hopes for certain things to turn around?
I think that there's a resiliency. I think, you know, the United Nations has said that small farming is really the most sustainable way for people to be eating food. It's not the big multinationals. That's when things kind of can go awry very quickly. That's where we see all of the listeria outbreaks and the food safety concerns. They're not coming from the little guys. They're coming from the big ones. So I am seeing more. Nova Scotia also has this fantastic track record of, in the last census, it's the only province in the entire country where we're growing small farms. So more people are entering small farming in Nova Scotia than anywhere else in the country, and I think that needs to be supported and heralded. I think it's a great thing. So I do see more young people coming on board. The skill set maybe not at the caliber and the capacity to grow the volumes of food that we need, but give these folks 10 years and they'll be there. You know, they will be there. They will have the skill set to be able to grow as much as, you know, we can do as is needed, I think. So I feel that the future is bright, but we do need some help, certainly in terms of infrastructure and changing the culture, even in institutional buying. Why are hospitals not serving fantastic food from local folks, universities? Like, there's lots of inroads certainly that can be made, but it's a chicken and egg situation. The volumes of produce isn't there because no one's buying it, and you can't ask the farmers to ramp up if there's no contract to pay them.
Certainly, and that's a great point, and I think it's going to take us very nicely into the next question, which I think is the question we've probably all heard before. And just before I unveil it, I just wanted to say that you know, one other piece that gives me a lot of belief in the local food system here in Nova Scotia are the many stories coming from the businesses selling local food, selling value-added local food. And one local initiative, which you are likely all well aware of, is the FarmWorks Investment Cooperative in Nova Scotia. And FarmWorks Investment, for those listening, is a cooperative, and it's quite unusual actually to have. It's technically a CDIF. Amy, do you know? Can you give me what those letters stand for? CDIF.
Community Development Investment Fund.
Thank you. So it is a community development investment fund, which means that each of us as Nova Scotians can invest in this fund. And it is a fund in which so far people have been getting a return. And with that money, it's specifically going to support local producers. So, Anne, I don't think that your farm, have you guys interacted with FarmWorks?
We've interacted and supported and done things with FarmWorks, but we're not currently clients of FarmWorks.
Okay, great. But there are certainly lots of great local businesses that are, and certainly many within the farmers market sector, that's for sure.
Yes.
So I think it's one example that also speaks to, I think, what has been talked about here, which is that culture change as well that has to come along with it. And there are clearly some inroads being made when you think of Nova Scotians that are choosing to buy local and also to invest local. That's, I think, something we have here, and it's quite unusual. So that question that what we were talking about, I think, gets us to is it possible for Nova Scotia to feed itself? Can we all start eating local food? And then to make the conversation a little bit more realistic, sort of where do we start? Nothing happens overnight. But does anyone want to jump in on that? Maybe everybody might have something to say about it.
I guess the first point maybe that I would say, when you do small-scale farming, sometimes you have the pleasure of talking to a lot of old-timers, picking people's brains. And the one thing that I can say is 2 generations ago, 85% of the food that Nova Scotians ate came from Nova Scotia. So is it possible? I'd say darn tootin', it is possible. It has been done before. So yeah, maybe not bananas and mangoes and oranges, but certainly, meat, vegetables, dairy, our basic staple foods certainly could be coming from Nova Scotia.
Did you? Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I mean, I like that optimism, and I mean, I'm going to go with I agree. I mean, I think that the change is going to come in incrementally, obviously, and I think what's surfacing here tonight is that there are so many of these underlying factors that contribute to this. And I think, just as we have opportunities to purchase local food, I think more and more as consumers and as members of society, we have more opportunities to be touched by local food. So I think with this surge in rising food costs, what we're also seeing is a rise in urban agriculture, a rise in community gardens, a rise in farmers markets, more community-supported agriculture, more bulk buying programs. Like, we're seeing things that are indirectly exposing us to local food and to the joy that local food brings and to meeting our farmers and all of those things. So I think that shift that's going to happen with consumers is very possible. And as that slowly happens, we can slowly start to up the supply. We slowly meet demand. We put in place institutional procurement policies. Our hospitals have local food. Our schools have healthy food programs. So, all of these things working together, will help us get there. Whether or not it's going to be 100%, I mean, part of me, I think Nova Scotia and Canada is always going to be a trading nation, but ultimately, how close can we get to food resiliency and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I would wholeheartedly agree with Amy there. I think that just moving the needle, I think, is where it needs to start. I don't think we're ever going to be 100%, to be perfectly honest, and I don't think that the economy here is built to be 100%. But I think that it can be a lot higher than it is now, and I think that the combination of both the social and the political will is really there, or at least beginning to on the political side from the little bit I'm beginning to see, or at least they're looking to try to find new ways, new industries. But I think that on the social level, the will is definitely there to engage more in this. And I think that if you are looking at the economic situation right now, it makes perfect sense to push forward. I think that there is a very, very good argument to say that you're not going to get that much better of an environment right now to push for local food than when everything imported from the United States is 40% more than it was 30 years ago, just on a currency level. So that alone is huge. But I also think that we need to also account for some of the things that Anne mentioned, and that is that input costs are also a lot higher for local farmers in many ways. And so that also needs to be sort of figured out and looked at by the government, and how could we maybe figure out better ways of fixing that situation, and perhaps giving this industry a bit of a boost and incentivizing this industry. Because, okay, so I mean, I believe in markets and all that kind of good stuff, but I also think that when you have an industry that is just beginning to grow and rise, I think you do need to offer it some level of incentive and protection before it's ready to fully, compete. And I believe that when it comes to local markets, I think that that's just the same as it is on huge national markets as well. And so I think if this is an industry that the government wants to back and wants to assist, I believe that there are ways of going about that, and there are ways of making it easier, and infrastructure is pretty much the start.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and for me, that really what Andrew was just saying just reiterates and brings to mind the point that our provincial government has actually set a target for local food consumption here in Nova Scotia. So under the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, our provincial government has made a commitment that by the year 2020, 20% of the food consumed in Nova Scotia would be produced in Nova Scotia. So that would be an increase up from 13%, which was the stat in 2011. And then interestingly, the Ivany report, it had something as well to say about agriculture. And in fact, parts of the Ivany report emphasize the importance of our agricultural industry on our economy. I think it was goal 17, if anyone wants to look it up, in the Ivany report, states that, well, basically that we should be aiming for doubling our domestic agricultural products here in the province, our provincial domestic. So not 20%, but 50%. So that sounds pretty appealing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So what about going into a bit more specifics in terms of, I guess I'll throw two parts out to you at the same time and see what grabs your attention. But one is around, what is the next step in terms of local food infrastructure here in Nova Scotia, and also what's the role in terms of infrastructure and culture change and incentivizing all these pieces? What's the role of our government, of our municipal governments, our provincial governments? If anyone wants to take a stab at either or both of those.
I mean, the first thing I would say is that food is a cross-cutting issue. So whether you're looking at within the municipality or within the province, at the level of the province, it doesn't sit within the Department of Ag or the Department of Education. It is a business issue, it's agriculture, it's education, it's all of these things. And so I think the communication between departments is extremely critical in looking at the solutions that are going to solve this thing. And I would say that also applies for municipalities as well. Like, food is a planning issue, it's a transportation issue, it's an issue connected to affordable housing. So all of that sits within municipal jurisdiction, and I think there are many ways that the municipality can actually work on those issues. So just the notion of food as a cross-cutting issue, I think, is a really critical one. Within the municipality, I would add, first I just want to say that I think Halifax is doing really great. I think, fortunately, we have a mayor who is a great champion for food, and food security has been identified as a key priority for Halifax, and so a number of programs are sort of emerging to support food across the city, including a great community garden program, and other programs like that. I think municipal food policy councils are Sorry, I'm just hearing a baby.
Real life on the farm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. No problem. Yeah, yeah. So looking at the ways in which cities are designed, making sure that transportation is in place so that people can access grocery stores and food outlets, making sure there are green spaces for people to enjoy and install community gardens, things like that. All of these sort of things exist at the municipal level, and I'm going to end it there. I'm going to let someone else talk.
Yeah,
And
I
do
mean,
you
I would.
have, oh, great. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, no, I mean, I think that what is key is for the government. I mean, the best way to really figure out how to make this industry as effective and resilient as possible is, for the government to continue to sit down with the local farmers and figure out what is most needed within the system, and then try to create those types of incentives for them, and for other businesses to work with them. I think that that's sort of the most critical factor. And for those industries to really be nurtured at this point, at this sort of critical phase, so that they can be more effective and really scale up to push that needle up to 20, even 50% at a certain point in the future. Because I think that it's very, very difficult. I'm sure that Anne could probably back this up. It's very, very difficult for small-scale local farmers to compete with the industrial food industry in certain aspects, and that getting some type of incentives in place, especially for the type of needed infrastructure that they would have to have, and also perhaps to even, and I think that Amy had mentioned this, to set up sort of agreements with a lot of local government-run, to a degree, industries, such as like hospitals and schools and universities, where the government does have an influence, and to make those deals and to figure out ways of getting more local food into the system, and making it more everywhere, and not just at the farmers markets, which I think is an excellent start and is an excellent system. But in order to get to that 20, 50%, you need to move beyond those particular ways of distributing it.
I guess my comment, as a farmer, I would love to see more infrastructure assistance. Also, I'm actually with a group of folks here in the Annapolis Valley who are looking to start a producer co-op, so that we can come together and solve some of these distribution issues, because we're all driving to the city in each of our individual cars and we're doing our own invoicing. It doesn't make sense. So if we could spend more time farming and less time doing some of that and consolidate some of those pieces, I think all of our businesses would be better. However, obtaining money to do that, or to buy a building, or to have consolidated cold storage or freezing rooms or processing lines, is going to be a challenge for us, certainly. It's something that I would love to have help from the Department of Agriculture. As a farmer, that's sort of the first place that you start. However, I will also say that FarmWorks has sort of, on at least verbally, said, yeah, we're happy to support these sorts of initiatives. So just come to us and we'll, kind of make it happen. So, which is interesting that the private sector is the one stepping up to the plate. Yeah. In addition to that, I guess another thing that I did want to say is that, in a comment to what Andrew was saying, I did attend one of these back and forth sort of conversations with the Department of Agriculture about 6 weeks ago, where they are doing some focus groups with small farmers, and they're trying to listen to what it is that what we really do need. Infrastructure and some of the red tape associated with food safety concerns are on, are on the top of the top five list, sort of, that are things that are holding folks back. So in addition to access to capital, so the department is sort of getting on board with that, and that's a good thing. I guess the only other thing, municipality, I wanted to sort of just cheer on Amy's comment that these are complex issues, and that it does involve an interdisciplinary, interdepartmental conversations with people. Starting, even something as simple as starting a community garden will involve many different areas, even in municipal government, to get the land, to get the permits, to be able to do it, to get somebody to say okay. Like, these are complex issues. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Kelty, the one point I'll just add is, our sort of newly elected Prime Minister has indicated that a national food strategy is in his plan, which, is the first time that we've ever seen that, and I think a huge step. And, he has even said that he is relying on his staff in provinces to feed up the messages and the needs and the desires from those provinces to inform this national food strategy. And so I think, as working at the Ecology Action Centre and all the sort of constituents that we touch, and as a member of society that cares deeply about this, I mean, these messages do need to be brought up and filtered to our politicians, to the people in respective positions of power, so that ideally this national food strategy does come to fruition and is truly informed by provinces across the country.
And I would add that I think that what Anne was saying about doing things like creating the infrastructure and creating things like streamlining the process and a lot of the red tape, if that can be done, then that's really one of the biggest things that government can really do. Government doesn't have to throw money at this. The government in Nova Scotia is relatively broke, and a lot.
Oh, I think we lost you for a second, Andrew.
The system.
Yeah. I think we lost you for a second right after you said our province is a little bit broke.
Oh. Yeah, so the province is a little bit broke, but a lot of places are a little bit broke, so it's nothing to be ashamed of. If these things can be streamlined and the infrastructure can be there, I think that private money will follow if they can see a more transparent, a more profitable way of getting involved, and one that won't kind of run into all of these roadblocks. I think what government can do there is sort of facilitate the industry and incentivize that industry for private money to come in.
Yep.
And I think it would be pretty fair to say that farmers are very hard workers. So it's not too often that farmers are looking for a handout. They're usually looking for a good opportunity, and they'll take full advantage of that, and they're willing to put in the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes to run a business. So. Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of questions here from folks through social at you guys. We'll just start with just two. And for those who are watching live, please do feel free to put a question out on Facebook or Twitter. We will wrap up within the next 15 minutes or so, but we'll take a few questions in the meantime. So the first question, I think, relates a bit to the whole question of seasonal eating, and also if Nova Scotia can feed itself, and what that diet might look like in that case. So this is from Gary Hunt, and I'll sort of pull parts of the question, but he said, we all know the cost of produce is high currently because of the Canadian dollar, and many things are not in season. So to purchase a cauliflower at a retail grocery store, let's say for discussion's sake, is $5. With new technologies for power, lighting, etc., could we grow non-traditional crops here in Nova Scotia that would be more expensive than that crop would cost in summertime in Nova Scotia? But could it actually be less expensive than the national chain prices? He also adds a comment that there's a huge market here in Nova Scotia that does support local as much as we can, whatever the season. He said for himself, he'd rather purchase a pepper from a local producer in winter and pay more than purchasing it as an import, where in his experience, it lasts a day and then it's rotten. Anne, do you want to speak to some of the sort of possibilities around season extension?
Sure. So I guess the long and short to make that sort of thing happen is a lot of greenhouses. And then consequently heating greenhouses to produce crops that are completely out of our traditional season. My husband and I did grow broccoli successfully with some non-expensive, just season extension options, and we were able to have broccoli through Christmas. Now, that's not February, but it's at least through Christmas, which is, you know, that's okay. Beyond that, you're getting into heating greenhouses. It could be done. To be honest, I have not crunched the numbers, and that's what it would take, is crunching numbers. It would also take just building a lot of acreage under glass or plastic, and then heating it with either biofuels or there are some grain burners and that sort of thing. So there are some creative ways to heat greenhouses. Have I crunched the numbers on growing cauliflower in January? I have not. But Den Haan is growing cucumbers under glass, and they grow English cucumbers that you find in the grocery store. I think they start coming out with those in about March or April. I think they don't grow through the dead of winter in January and February, but then they start back up again, and you do start seeing things. So we are really challenged in January and February. It takes a lot of heat units to make food grow at that time of year. However, I think we could be a little bit more creative and do some trial and error, and that's where you know, Dalhousie Ag School could come into play, doing some trials and on season extension. Yeah, it's definitely worth looking into.
And one other question that just came in from Gregory Smith that's somewhat related to that is just around hydroponic production. And my understanding is the two major greenhouses that I think of in the province, Den Haan and Stockdyke, are they both, they're producing cucumbers and peppers and things like, and tomatoes. Are they both hydroponic systems? Do you know much about hydroponics? Anything you would add on that?
I don't know much about hydroponics, and I don't. Stockdyke, I think, is utilizing some hydroponics, but I really can't. I don't know those businesses well enough to say. Sure. Hydroponic, as the style of farming that we do, I don't really like hydroponic food, but does that mean it can't be done, or that somebody couldn't do it? Sure.
Well, am I right that you guys on occasion use a horse? It could be hard to bring your horse into a greenhouse hydroponic system.
Yes, we do use a draft horse for cultivation and some farm work around. So we're kind of at the other end of spectrum, and we actually really like dirt. So we think dirt's a good thing to grow food in, and so we're not so keen on hydroponics because it's basically water and chemicals, whether they're natural chemicals or not. But that's how food's grown hydroponically. That's not to, again, it's not to say that there's anything particularly wrong. If folks want to do that, it won't be me. That's all.
Sure. And I think, yeah, in Nova Scotia, we have quite a diversity of farms and farm practices, and we have lots of innovative farms, that's for sure as well. I mean, this time of year at the farmers market, I'm still buying my greens. I'm still getting spinach and mash, which is a green I had never heard of in the past, and it's now my new sort of winter favorite lettuce, and kale and things like that. So, I mean, we have farmers producing food right now with, limited daylight hours and cold temperatures, and some of that is heated greenhouse, some of that is without even heating a greenhouse. So it's pretty amazing what is happening here in the province. Andrew, I've got a question that I think might be great for you. I know we keep slotting you in very seriously as the economist here. But this question is from William Zimmerman. And he asked if someone could comment on the impact of the TPP on buy local programs and government efforts to promote local food. So I have heard this a little bit in terms of does the TPP limit what the government can actually put into place in terms of incentives or legislation to buy local first, for example? What does that mean for us?
I would think that, and I'm not an expert on the TPP per se, but I would say that from what I have seen, these agreements can be a little tricky in that, and CETA was also a little bit tricky. I think in some ways I'm a little bit more familiar with that one with the European Union, but I think that one of the problems with a lot of these agreements is that in order to gain access to these markets, as far as reducing tariffs and all of this good stuff, governments and sometimes middle powers like Canada tend to give up a bit too much at times, and this can often create a spillover effect regarding allowing competitiveness from foreign exports to come in. That said, I think that regardless at this point, the TPP hasn't started, and we are looking at very, very weak Canadian dollar, even relative to some of the Asian currencies. It's not just versus the US dollar. The Canadian dollar is pretty weak across the board. And so the production locally will still be very competitive, is very competitive.
Andrew, I'm sorry we lost you for a second again then. I don't have you back yet.
Get this industry
but if you can...
resilient and effective enough so that if there are...
Are you guys losing Andrew?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew, we lost you for a second
Is that
there.
better?
Let's try one more time. You were just mentioning, you were partway through, but not all the way. Maybe jump back in.
Sure. I think I was saying what I was trying to say was that you need, regardless of the TPP or CETA with the European Union, I think that right now, because neither is really in full effect, especially the TPP, which was just recently signed, the Canadian currency is weak across the board, and so anything being imported in is going to be relatively expensive given the Canadian currency, and so I think that right now is a good time to create this industry in a resilient way, because you also don't want to have an industry that you have to constantly subsidize either. That's a slippery slope. So I think that you want to create an industry that is competitive both locally and globally. And for the interim, this is a good opportunity and a good time to get it off its feet. And for countries like Canada are sometimes a mixed bag because a lot has to be given up in order to gain access to those types of teams. So I think that we'll see how it affects the buy local economy, but I do feel as if this is something that is more of a worry down the road than it is really right now, and I think that we could take a good opportunity right now in order to make this a more effective industry.
Thank you, Andrew. Did either of you want to add anything in on that?
I don't think so.
We'll leave the TPP talk to Andrew.
I guess the only thing about TPP from a local farming perspective is that if we took, for example, organic standards and things coming across, we haven't necessarily, the Canadian and U.S. standards or Mexican standards for organic aren't necessarily the same, and so we are going to run into, once we start crossing borders more and more, and that's just on certified organic produce, but that's just one example of where things get sort of wonky or weird. Milk, dairy certainly is another one. The United States does allow growth hormones for the animals being treated, whereas Canada does not across the board, Nova Scotia included. So for a lot of folks, milk products even coming in to subsidize our recent milk shortage or butter shortage was a concern even for my family, because we don't like those growth hormones, and we don't really want them coming across the border into our butter. So we're going to run into some of those issues, I think. And that's a concern just for our food supply and what we think is safe.
Yeah.
And I would also note that China is not a part of the TPP, so a lot of the massive exports that we get of certain things from China, whether it's meat or produce, would not be subject to that free trade agreement. However, things like New Zealand dairy and things like that, which are huge industries at those places, is in the TPP. So we do need to gear ourselves a bit for being competitive globally. And as Anne pointed out, having very different standards. Though supposedly these trade agreements are supposed to sort of standardize the standards, but they very rarely do that.
I guess one thing I could say that might be hopeful is that Andrew just mentioned New Zealand, but New Zealand got their stock for lamb actually started mostly from Nova Scotian lamb. So there's hope there that maybe it could go the other way also, or we could start exporting fantastic lamb from Nova Scotia elsewhere.
Well, we haven't really talked on the fisheries in Nova Scotia, but that's certainly a piece of our local food system. And when it comes to the fisheries, my experience is often that it's easier for people to access Nova Scotia seafood elsewhere than it is here in our own province. So there's an important role right now to play to bring seafood into the local food movement and the buy local movement, the farmers market movement, where it certainly deserves to be, and where it can contribute to our food security and our rural communities. So I'm going to, at this point, I've got sort of one wrap-up question for everyone, but before we go to that, I just wanted to ask if anyone had comments they wanted to add. Sorry, Andrew, are we overlapping?
Oh no, sorry. I was gonna make a comment on the seafood thing, and I think that this is something to be a little wary of, and that is that. And even more wary of now with a cheaper Canadian dollar, and that is that, having spent, time at places like Tsukiji Fish Market in Tokyo and stuff, like I've seen a lot of very beautiful Nova Scotia tuna, but it's never in Nova Scotia. And, so a lot of our seafood is shipped out, especially to places like Japan. And that might only continue more because it'll be cheaper for them to purchase it given the weaker dollar. So that's something we also have to keep track of in the system, is how much of certain products that this province was known for a long time, and the Maritimes in general, might be fleeing to global markets because they have more buying power to have it, which means that we don't have it locally.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. All right, so with that, I'm going to ask each of you if there's anything, as was said earlier, we've just taken about an hour, I guess close to an hour and 15 minutes now, to talk about a very complex, sometimes scary, also inspiring conversation. So if there's anything that maybe was missed from the conversation tonight that comes to mind still for you, or if there's anything you would love to sort of reiterate before we're wrapping up.
I think the conversation was great. I think we touched on a lot of things and very multiple sort of issues that are related to this. It's a really complex issue and not one that can be solved overnight or by any single individual organization or government. And so I think just continuing this dialogue, continuing to sort of surface the issues from multiple perspectives and bring those forward is going to be critical to finding a path forward. And I think that a path forward is absolutely possible. So it's just continuing to work on that, and keep doing that.
I guess I'm really encouraged, specifically because I'm not an economist and don't run in those circles, nor a lot of analysis, but on the gut level, I feel like the buy local movement is growing, our customers are growing, we see more people coming to the farmers markets, and so to have sort of also an economic back that our dollar isn't so great right now, so let's take advantage of this opportunity, is a really important message that we can build a great resilient system, and the time is now. Let's do it. That's sort of how I'm feeling about this, and so I think that's great. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
I would just echo both of them had a really fun time. Thank you for inviting me on the panel. This is sort of fun for me, and I would add that, yeah, I think that there's a lot of really good indicators here, a lot of good momentum here, and I think that, you know, opportunities are only opportunities if you don't miss them, right? So I think you should, so we should take advantage. And I think that there is the right type of momentum. I think it's really kind of bringing it all together at this point and figuring out good, effective, best practices and policies.
That's great. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap us up in my personal favorite style, which is, well, you guys kind of just did it with a bit of inspiration, but I planned a question to pull a little more out of you. So so we'll just have to go with it. Yeah, I'd love to wrap up with your final thoughts on why you know, why Nova Scotia should focus on local, or you may want to go more personal in terms of why you have a passion for local, and I'd love to hear people on social media sharing you know, their reasons as well. We did have one person earlier today, Linda Murphy, shared a message on our Facebook page sort of to that effect. So I'll start with that while you guys gather your thoughts. But Linda Murphy had said, support more community gardens, provincially support more self-sustainability by using greenhouses to grow our own for Nova Scotia first mindset. Fruits and vegetables, and promote government investment in these initiatives. So yeah, do you guys have anything else to add to that? More inspiration to pile on there?
From the farming perspective, people are hopeful, and we have a really good and growing group of small-scale farmers who are ready to grow food. They're ready to grow more. If there was only somewhere for it to go that was where people would pay a fair price for it and they could get it there, you know, relatively easily. I feel that the capacity is much more than we have more capacity than we have, and the demand is there, so it's aligning those two. But we have a really great group of really hardworking, creative, innovative folks here who grow food, and that's a heck of a good start when you want to start local food systems.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll just speak personally. Like for me, like the first answer that pops into my head is I can't see very many reasons not to buy local food. Like I mean, for me, local food, it has a different level of quality. It's fresher. For me, there's a whole experience that comes with buying local food, and there's a very specific element of trust. You know, I've always cared about knowing what goes into my food, and I have a different level of trust for food when I know, you know, who's grown it, where it comes from, how it's grown, things like that, and that actually makes me feel a lot better. And so for me, buying local food is really tied to my personal values, and that notion of being able to support my neighborhood, my community, the people like living in my province. I think all of those things tie into it, and so it's like personally kind of a no-brainer for me.
I would say for me, I think my final thoughts on this is that whenever you have the opportunity to really build some kind of a new industry like this, and it actually makes sense, I think that it's silly not to. I think that the economic spillover to the rest of the community and the province could be very, very high and create a lot of good, diverse, decent paying jobs over time. And I think that this is really one of the main keys. It's sort of, you know, we sometimes get so obsessed with making things as cheap as possible so the consumer has more money, but even if the consumer has more money, but the only place they can work is Walmart, well, in the long run doesn't usually work. And so we've seen this effect hit a lot of different places of always using the excuse that, well, it's cheaper for the consumer, so it must be good for the economy. And initially I think that's fine, but I think when you get yourself in a situation like now, as Anne was pointing out, the local producers can compete with a lot of the imports, especially if they're given the right incentives. And I think that that creates a far wider economic spillover. And so, I mean, even though I'm an American, I would say, why would you want, I mean, why would you want to be creating an economic effect in California when you could create one right here?
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. And certainly the term that comes up for me as you're talking is around import replacement. You know, what can we be growing and producing here in Nova Scotia so that we don't need to import it from elsewhere? And yeah, so we can have that economic ripple effect here in Nova Scotia as opposed to elsewhere. So with that, I'll just share 2 messages that came in on social, and then we'll wrap up. So the first is from G. Compton, and he says, we can grow food in our cities as well. We can grow food in our homes and on our properties, on rooftop gardens, in greenhouses, balcony gardens, and in our parks. And I think that that's all part of it too. So individuals experiencing dirt, as Anne enjoys experiencing dirt, or soil might be a better term for it. Sorry, she, Compton. Yeah, so I think that's a great point as well. And then the last thing is that someone made a point to tell us that the Denheim, that's one of the greenhouses we were talking about in Nova Scotia, their cucumbers are available now. It's true. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone listening, and for the fantastic media in Nova Scotia that has been covering the rising cost of food and the many multifaceted effects that it has on our community, and that took the time today to talk about it as well in relation to this panel. And also a big thank you to our tech person who's behind the scenes. You don't get to see her, but Jillian Wellesley, who does the social media for us at the Farmers Markets of Nova Scotia, and much more. And she really was the one that put this all together. So a big thank you to her. And as we had let people know, this recording of this conversation will be available. So if you know someone who might be interested, if you want to share it with your local politician, please go ahead and send them the link. We'd certainly appreciate it. And it's one more step towards a more local food system and a stronger Nova Scotia economy. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.